Yellarikum Vanakkam. In this video, I'm going to be talking about files in Python. So what is a file? A file is anything that stores any type of data or information. This could be a photo file, a PNG file, or an audio file, or the two that we'll be talking about today are text files and CSV files. And I'll talk more about what a CSV file is later on. And so with files, there's something called file handling, which is the ability to operate on the files, whether that's reading the file or writing into the file. Those are the two main operations you can do, but there's some other ones as well. Something that's useful to files in Python is that each line is terminated with either a special character or a new line, which makes it easier to access and do things with. And so that's one of the reasons why people use Python for files. It's easy to access the data and manipulate it the way you want to. And it's also simple to handle because, like we talked about in the first video, Python is an interpreted language. So it goes one line at a time. And when the file is split into that, each line is split with a new line character, it's easy to parse through. So there are two main ways to open a file in Python. So the first one is using the open command with the file name inside the parentheses and then storing that in a variable. So that F can be any name, but F stands for file, so people usually use that. But in this method, you have to remember to close the file. So when you open it, you need to, after you're done using the file, you need to remember to use that function f.close, or else that can mess up what you're trying to do with the file. The second way that you can open a file in Python, which this is a way that I prefer, is using the with statement. So it's with open and then the file name inside the parentheses as f. And again, that f could be any variable name. And then you indent and then put whatever statements you're going to do with the file in there. So it's kind of like a loop kind of syntax. And the reason why I prefer this method is because it automatically closes the file when you exit that indent. It essentially means the file is closed. And so it's just, I feel like it's just overall better so you don't forget to close the file. There's also a few ways to read a file. So the first, kind of going along with that first way to open, you can input the R argument. So R stands for read, and you can put it just like you see it in the quotes as an argument. And this is just extra. It defaults to reading, so if you don't include that argument, it'll default to reading the file. So you don't need to include it, but you can do it just for clarity's sake. And then the second way revolves around these three commands. So the first one is f.read, and this command essentially reads the entire file and returns the whole thing as one string. F.read lines with an S, it reads the entire file still, but it returns a list of strings. So each line is a separate element that's a string in one list. And then f.readLine is this command only reads one line and returns just that as a string. So you could call that command repeatedly if you want to print each line with a separate command. And another way is just using a for loop. I'll show you an example of that when we look at the demo later. And then another important thing about files, ways to write in and append to a file. So the main way to do this, you can again use the letter command. So like we had R for read. For write, it's W. And writing in the sense means it creates a new blank file and then writes whatever you're writing to that. So this is important to note when you're picking the file name for a file that you're writing to, because if you choose a file name that already exists, it'll erase everything that's in that file and then fill it with whatever you're trying to write. So just make sure you're not putting any file name that already exists or that you don't want the contents to be erased. And then one way to bypass that is to use the A argument. So A stands for append. So this basically means adding to the existing contents of the file. So it won't erase what's already in there, but if you want to add to it, that's append is used for that. And then no matter if you're using W or A, you use this dot write command to actually physically write it into the file. So this would be the line that you would put inside the with statement, or a for loop or something like that. So then you do f dot write. Again, the f can be any variable name. But one thing to note is that files, you can only read and input strings, so it has to be a string. So you have to cast, if you're going to use an integer or a float, you need to cast it with the str function to write it into the file. So right now I will show you an example of all those things that I've just talked about. So here is just the first example using the with statement to open a file. And really quickly, I just want to talk about these two lines. So these two lines are specifically to access files that are local to your computer, but using when you're using Google Colab. So if you're using a local developer, like we talked about in the first video, you don't need this because both the file and the Python ID would be local. But since it's a cloud-based, you need these two lines to kind of access the file. So I already ran it and got the file accessible, so that's why I commented it out. But when you're first doing it, make sure to add these two lines. And then here I have the with statement. So the name of my text file is sample copy, and then I added the R argument. Again, I don't have to add it, but I just added it there for just to make it clear. And then the variable name I chose is file. Very simple. And so this is all this is doing is just printing the sample copy. So I use the function .read, which will return the whole thing as a string. I could also do read.lines. I'll show you what that looks like soon. So if I just run it, this is what the text file says. And this is all one string. Even though there are new lines, it's all contained in one string. Now I could do this to show you the difference. So each one is contained in its own element in this whole list. So it's a little different. So now if we look down here, now I'm going to try to append. So I'm going to append, but that's essentially the same thing as writing. I just want to add it to this file instead of creating a new file. So I'll remove the comments. So in this case, I have the A argument, and I created a file2 variable, and I'm trying to add hello again. So I have the write function like we talked about. We can run this. And so it didn't print anything yet because it's just added it to the file, because we still need this block of code to read the file again, the same way we did it in the first part. So I'll uncomment this, and I'm just going to comment this part out so it doesn't redo what we've done. Hopefully this should work. And there we go. Hello again is there. And if we wanted to add a new line, we would put a new line character right there to make it follow that format. We could do that now. So there. And there we go. It added it aside from that, but you can see it's right here. So that's how you do. That's how you use these functions: the dot read lines and dot read line functions. Now here's another way to print each line. So this is using a for loop. It's quite simple. So you're using the same with open statement, putting it in this variable file, and then you're saying for each line in file, just print the line. And so remember, since each line ends with a new line, you're printing each sentence one at a time. So if you're doing things with lists and elements in a list, you need to make sure to keep that in mind. If you want the first element of the first line, you need to index it properly. So I'll just run this to show you. So it prints each line. So you can compare these two outputs. And this one is printing it in multiple different lines instead of the one string. One thing to note is these two statements are printed in one line because we didn't add the new line for this statement. So it's counted as the same line as in goodbye. So it's printed in the same line here. But then the second hello again is separate. So you can kind of see the difference and similarities in these two ways of reading and writing text files. And so now we can talk about CSV files. So this is another type of file that you can parse through in Python. So a CSV stands for comma separated values. That just means that the comma it's called a delimiter. So that basically means it's the character used to separate the values. So comma is the default one, but you could use anything like a tab or a colon. Depends on just what the data is and what's best to use. And so reading and writing CSV files is very similar to a text file. So you open it this same way, except you end it with .csv instead of .txt. But one important thing to note is that you need to import the CSV module. And I'll talk more about what a module is in the next video. But that's something you need to do to work with CSV files in Python. And reading a CSV file, there's a different command. So you use the csv.reader function, and you store that in a variable. You could call it anything, but I called it csv_reader. But essentially you pass that variable f into the csv.reader function, like you did with the .read function and .read lines. It's like that. And you could also indicate the delimiter. By default, again, it's comma, but you could change it to what you want. So that's how you read the CSV file. Writing a CSV file, you use the csv.writer function. Again, you store it into the any variable. You could call it anything, but I called it csv_writer just to keep it simple. And then in order to actually write a new line, you use the .writeRow function, and then whatever you put inside the parentheses is what will be written. And so it's a similar concept to the text files, but just a little bit different in the actual functions you're using. And another similarity is that you can use for loops for CSV files in a similar way I just showed you for the text files, where you're going through line by line. So I'll show you one example. Right here we have the import CSV module, and then here again those two statements, but I've already imported the file, so I'm going to comment those out. And then here we have again that with statement, but here is the CSV file name, which is grade list. And then again I have R, but you don't need this. I could even take it out to show you that you don't need it, because it's default to reading. And then this is the file name I chose, csv_file. It could be anything. And so then this line is essentially reading the file and putting it into this variable, csv_reader. And then here you have the for loop. So this will, like in the last example, it'll print each line in that variable. So I'm run this, and then we see here. So we have the headers. We have the two elements in this first list indicate what these values are. So the first element is the first name, and then the second is the grade. And you can see that they're each stored in a list, which is a little bit different to the text files. I mean, depending on what way you're using to read it. But this can be helpful if you're trying to access certain elements. So if you wanted to access just the grade level, you could specifically put that index. So since that's that's the second element but the first index. So if you run this, you'll just get the grade. So you can see how this is useful to certain data science topics. And we'll talk more about how this relates to different modules in the next video. I also wanted to show you where you can kind of see where your files are on Google Colab when you use these two functions or these two code lines. So if you go here to this folder right here where it says files, if you click on it, it has a list of files that you've imported. And you can see we have the grade list that we just used and sample copy.txt. So that's useful to keep track of that. So that's it for today's video. Stay tuned for the last video of this series next week. Again, I'll be talking about modules and packages in Python. I'll just give a brief introduction about that next week. It's a very broad topic, but I'll try my best to kind of give you the rundown. And see you then.